Aggression on minorities. Hello everyone. In our series of aggression on minorities in world, we will discuss all the countries that are being accused of abusing minorities. Today we are going to discuss about world's second largest economy and second largest population. I hope you know the name, China. Why we are talking about this? Because in February 2023, this is a hot topic of discussion in UN about Chinese actions in Xinjiang province on Uyghur Muslim minority and on Hong Kong. This video will be in two parts, because there have been a lot of accusing on Chinese government about abusing human right of its minority and diverse population in different regions. Today we will be talking about three regions that are long in discussion and world see these actions of Chinese government as repressive and inhuman because of the treatment towards minority, government policies, ethnic cleansing and cultural imposition. 1. Tibet. China's actions in Tibet have been a topic of concern for many years, with reports of human rights violations, mass killing, political prisoners and cultural suppression. China has long claimed sovereignty over Tibet, a region that has a distinct culture and language from the rest of China. Since the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949, there have been ongoing efforts to suppress Tibetan culture and promote Chinese language and culture in the region. In 1959, a Tibetan uprising against Chinese rule was brutally suppressed, and the Dalai Lama, Tibet's spiritual leader, was forced to flee to India and still living in India since then. In recent years, there have been reports of an increasing Chinese government crackdown in Tibet, with efforts to suppress Tibetan language and culture and to monitor and control the activities of religious leaders and practitioners. There have also been reports of human rights abuses, including the arbitrary detention and torture of political prisoners, restrictions on freedom of expression and association, and forced resettlement of Tibetan nomads. Regarding China's recent actions in Tibet, it's important to note that reliable information can be difficult to obtain due to China's strict controls on media and information. However, reports from human rights organizations and Tibetan activists suggest that the situation in Tibet remains a concern for those who value human rights and cultural diversity. China in Tibet has maintained a strong military and political presence in the region for many years. The Chinese government has implemented policies to promote Chinese language and culture in Tibet, including the use of Mandarin Chinese in schools and official documents. Tibetan language and culture have been suppressed, with restrictions on the use of the Tibetan language in education and government. The Chinese government has placed tight controls on the activities of religious leaders and practitioners, including the Dalai Lama, and has encouraged the appointment of pro-China religious leaders. China has rejected criticism of its policies in Tibet and maintains that its actions in the region are necessary for maintaining stability and economic development. Human rights organizations have documented cases of political prisoners being detained and tortured in Tibet. The situation in Tibet remains a concern for many human rights organizations and Tibetan activists, who argue that China's policies in the region constitute a violation of the rights of the Tibetan people. For example, in March 2008, protests erupted in Tibet over Chinese policies in the region. Chinese authorities responded with a crackdown that led to widespread violence and bloodshed. The Chinese government stated that 19 people were killed in the protests, while Tibetan activists claimed that the death toll was much higher. 2. Xinjiang province. According to reports from human rights organizations and media outlets, hundreds of thousands to over 1 million Uyghur Muslims and other minority groups in Xinjiang have been detained in what the Chinese government calls re-education, or vocational training, centers. There have been reports of torture, forced labor, and restrictions on religious and cultural practices in these facilities. There have also been reports of forced labor outside of these centers, with Uyghur Muslims and other minority groups being sent to work in factories and other industries throughout China. It is being said that some of these factories were supplier of cotton for H&M, parts of Apple devices and many other big corporates. Some reports all suggest that this forced labor may be part of a broader effort by the Chinese government to repress and assimilate minority groups. Regarding migration, it's difficult to determine how many people have left Xinjiang due to China's policies, as many Uyghur Muslims and other minority groups have been subject to restrictions on their movements and travel. However, some Uyghur Muslims and other minority groups have fled the region and sought asylum in other countries due to concerns about their safety and human rights. It's important to note that the situation in Xinjiang remains a concern for many human rights organizations and activists, who argue that China's policies in the region constitute a violation of the rights of minority groups. The Chinese government has rejected criticism of its policies and maintains that its actions in the region are necessary for maintaining stability and economic development. Inner Mongolia. The situation in Inner Mongolia, an autonomous region in northern China, has also raised concerns about the treatment of minority groups in the country. Inner Mongolia has a significant population of ethnic Mongols, who have a distinct culture and language. In recent years, there have been reports of measures by the Chinese government to promote Mandarin Chinese and reduce the use of the Mongolian language in education and official documents. This has led to protests by Mongols in the region, who argue that the policies threaten their cultural identity. In September 2020, protests erupted in Inner Mongolia over a policy by the Chinese government to replace Mongolian language instruction with Mandarin Chinese in some schools. The protests were met with a crackdown by Chinese authorities, with reports of detentions and arrests of Mongolian activists and parents who opposed the policy. The situation in Inner Mongolia has also raised concerns about the treatment of minority groups in China, and the perceived threats to their cultural and linguistic identity. The Chinese government has defended its policies in the region, arguing that they are necessary for promoting national unity and economic development. However, the protests and opposition by Mongols suggest that there are significant concerns about these policies in the region. Chinese government stands on its actions? From a political standpoint, the Chinese government's policies in these regions are often driven by a desire to maintain control over minority groups and prevent separatist movements. China views these regions as integral parts of the country and has long been sensitive to any perceived threats to its sovereignty. Economically, some of China's policies in these regions may be motivated by a desire to promote development and economic growth. For example, the Chinese government has invested heavily in infrastructure projects in Tibet and Xinjiang, which it sees as important for boosting the country's economic development. Socially, the Chinese government may also be motivated by a desire to promote national unity and cultural assimilation. For example, the policies in Inner Mongolia that promote Mandarin Chinese and reduce the use of the Mongolian language may be viewed as necessary for promoting a common national identity. The human rights abuses and treatment of minority groups have been a source of significant concern for world and human rights organizations around the world, and no reason can justify abuse of human rights. What this mean to world? China's actions in Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia have raised concerns about human rights abuses and the treatment of minority groups, and there are potential negative effects of these actions on a global level. Diplomatic tensions. China's treatment of minority groups has been criticized by many countries and human rights organizations around the world. This has led to diplomatic tensions between China and other countries, with some countries imposing sanctions or taking other measures to express their concerns. Economic impact. China's treatment of minority groups has raised concerns about labor practices, of forced labor and other human rights abuses in some industries. This led companies avoiding sourcing products from these regions. Humanitarian concerns. The documented human rights abuses in these regions have raised concerns about the treatment of minority groups and the potential for widespread human suffering. The international community has a responsibility to respond to these concerns and ensure that human rights are protected. Security concerns. The treatment of minority groups in Xinjiang has raised concerns about potential radicalization and security threats. Some experts have suggested that China's policies in the region could fuel extremism and lead to security threats both within China and in other parts of the world. There are a number of steps that can be taken to counter China's actions in Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia. Diplomatic pressure. The international community can exert diplomatic pressure on China to address its human rights abuses in these regions. Economic measures. Some countries and companies have taken steps to avoid sourcing products from these regions or investing in companies that may be involved in human rights abuses. Humanitarian aid. Providing humanitarian aid to those affected by China's policies in these regions can help to address the immediate needs of people who may be suffering as a result of these policies. International legal action. Some countries and human rights organizations have called for international legal action in UN and International Criminal Court against China for its human rights abuses in these regions. Countries opposing China at global stage. Several countries have expressed concern and taken measures to counter China's actions in Tibet, Xinjiang, and other regions. Some of the countries that have been particularly vocal in their criticism of China's human rights abuses include: United States and United Kingdom has imposed sanctions on Chinese officials and companies involved in human rights abuses in Xinjiang and Tibet. It has also restricted imports of certain goods from Xinjiang and called on China to respect the human rights of Uyghurs and other minority groups. Canada and Australia has condemned China's treatment of Uyghurs and other minority groups and has called for an independent investigation into the human rights abuses in Xinjiang. European Union. The European Union has expressed concern about China's human rights abuses in Tibet, Xinjiang, and other regions, and has called for an independent investigation into the situation in Xinjiang. Thank you everyone for your time. Please like and share the video. For more updates on global affairs, please subscribe my channel. Let us know your thoughts in comment section and the next topic you want to watch the video on.